Hello, children. This is Grandma Carla with more of Freddy Goes Camping by Walter R. Brooks, and we are on Chapter 6. Mr. Camphor had been right. They slept peacefully. The mosquitoes came singing through the trees, gave one sniff, and then flew off, whining angrily in search of more savory game. The ghost didn't bother them either, and when they woke up in the morning, the sun was slanting through the trees and sparkling on the lake, and they felt a lot more cheerful. Only there wasn't anything for breakfast. "Why can't we paddle across and have breakfast at your house?" said Freddy. "With Aunt Minerva?" Mr. Camphor inquired. Said Freddy. "Burnt toast. Let's see if there aren't some supplies in the hotel." They washed in the lake. Freddy had to keep his coonskin hat on for fear of being recognized by the woods animals, but he got the lower part of his face clean and then took the trail to Lakeside. Mr. Camphor went out to the kitchen, but Freddy said that he wanted to go into the office and look for clues. He found one almost at once. A long piece of cord was tied to the outside knob of the door that opened into the lounge. So that was the way our ghost made the door open so slowly, he said to himself. In the office, he looked in the desk drawer for Mrs. Fillmore's pistol, but it was gone. "The ghost came back after we left," he thought. "Probably wanted to get that gun. That's why he opened that door and then ran around outside and yelled at the window so we'd clear out." Pretty soon, Mr. Camphor came back from the kitchen. "Nothing there," he said, "but I found a loaf of bread and a glass of currant jelly." Freddy showed him the cord. "Our ghost, eh?" he said. "How disappointing. Dear me, I'd almost begun to believe in him." Freddy said, "I should think you'd be glad to find that whoever is causing all this trouble is real flesh and blood." "Well, I'm not. I'd much rather have a ghost to fight. What can a ghost do?" "He can scare you half to death, and that's all he can do," said Mr. Camphor. "He can't sneak up on you and hit you with a club. All he can do is yell in your ear. I bet you if a ghost jumped out and yelled at you and you just laughed at him, he'd burst into tears. My goodness, I feel kind of sorry for ghosts. They can't do a thing but glide around in sheets and moan and make scary noises. I suppose that's why they don't ever seem to accomplish much." "Well, you can have your ghost," Freddy said. "I'd rather be hit with a club than scared into fits." "And how about the giant cat looking in the window? Was that real?" "Oh, it was real all right. I never saw a cat that big. But it might be some kind of a leopard. I've heard of people training them to hunt. If it was..." He shivered. "It was a man in a false face," said Freddy. "Oh, yes it was, because I saw its eyes move, and they were brown. I've seen cats with yellow eyes and green and even blue ones, but I have never seen a cat with brown eyes." "You know what I think," Mr. Camphor said in a minute. "That man, whoever he is trying to scare people away from this hotel. He's been pretty successful at it, so he'll keep on playing ghost. And that means that he won't show himself in the daytime. So today is our chance to look around and try to find out something about him." They ate their bread and jelly, and then they went to work. "You know," said Mr. Camphor, "what puzzles me is how the ghost gets up here. And where does he go in the daytime? He can't just live in the woods. He must come nights. I checked the tire marks out on the roads, and the only ones are Mrs. Fillmore's." "I guess he glides," Freddy said. "You know, just kind of comes floating through the trees with a kind of faint fizzing noise." "Oh, let's have a look at the cellar," said Mr. Camphor. "You can tell more about folks by looking at their cellar than anywhere else in the house." The cellar was a mess. A water pipe had burst and flooded it, and evidently Mrs. Fillmore hadn't been able to get the break fixed. She had just turned the water off. Freddy examined the pipe, and then he said, "Look here. This pipe didn't break. It was gnawed." "Oh, go on," said Mr. Camphor. "I don't believe even an alligator could gnaw through an iron pipe." "I don't suppose one ever tried," Freddy said. "Anyway, this pipe isn't iron, it's lead, and look at those teeth marks. My guess is if We look again at those beams that fell down under the porch, we'd find the same marks." He looked meaningly at his friend. "And do you know who made them?" "Don't look at me," Mr. Camper protested. "I didn't do it." "No ghost is strong enough teeth to do it either," said Freddy. "Rats did it, and I'm afraid I know their names." "You don't mean those rats that were in my attic last year?" "Simon and his gang, yes. After we drove them out of your house, they could have got around the lake and up here, I suppose. This is just the kind of place they like. A big, rambling building with a storeroom full of food. Let's look at the pantry." But there were no signs of rats in the pantry, nor could he find any rat holes anywhere in the hotel. "That's queer," Freddy said. "I'm sure it was rats that tore up those hotel bedrooms, and it was rats that wrecked our camp. Those tent loops were gnawed, not cut. It's the kind of vandalism that rats think is fun. But I never knew 'em to pass up a good feed, and that pantry must have been full of supplies." "Speaking of supplies," said Mr. Camper, "I'd better paddle over and get some." Freddy said maybe he'd better go. He wanted to get Mrs. Wiggins' advice. "All right," said Mr. Camper. "Can you manage a canoe?" Until Mr. Camper had paddled him across the lake yesterday, Freddy had never been in a canoe. But it had looked pretty easy. "Oh, sure," he said confidently. So they went back to the camp, and Freddy turned the canoe over and slid it into the water and got in. Now, when he sat down in the stern seat, his weight made the bow come right up out of the water. He took a stroke with the paddle, as he had seen Mr. Camper do, but instead of going ahead, the canoe swung halfway around, and in his second stroke, whirled it further so that it was now pointing back to shore. "You'll have to put a rock in the bow to keep it down," Mr. Camper called. "You won't be able to manage it at all when you get it out there in the breeze." Freddy could see that this made sense, but how was he to get a rock? He was 10 yards from shore. He tried 2 more strokes, and then he was 20 yards from shore. Then he had made one more complete revolution. "The blame thing keeps skidding," he shouted. "How do you make it go straight?" Mr. Camper shouted back some instructions, but the breeze caught the canoe now and had blown it even farther out, and Freddy could not understand the words. He paddled furiously, and the harder he paddled, the faster he whirled. And every time he came around, he saw Mr. Camper standing on the shore, yelling and waving his arms, and growing smaller and smaller in the distance. It was a good thing for Freddy that the breeze was blowing in the direction he wanted to go, or goodness knows where he would have ended up. As it was, he was blown right across the lake and landed not far from Mr. Camper's house. Bannister, who had been watching, came down and helped pull the canoe up and told him that Mrs. Wiggins had gone back home. "I'll have to go down too," said Freddy. "There are some things I have to see to at the farm. Here's a list of things Mr. Camper made out. If you'll get them ready, I'll be back this afternoon. And golly, how'll I get across the lake?" But Bannister said that he could paddle him over. So when Freddy had taken off his camping disguise, which wasn't necessary on this side of the lake, he started for the bean farm. Mrs. Wiggins had told the animals all about Lakeside and about Mr. Camper's aunts, and they crowded around Freddy, firing questions and suggesting plans for getting rid of Miss Elmira and Miss Minerva. "Quiet, quiet," he said. "I can't hear myself think. Now listen, animals. Mrs. Wiggins has told you that our friend Mr. Camper is in need of help. But the case is more serious than we thought. It is a question of getting rid not only of the ants, but of a gang of... I don't know what to call them, because I don't know just what they are up to. But I can tell you who I think one of them is. Our old friend Simon." The animals exclaimed, "Simon? That scally-tailed old sneak. Let's go up and lick him. We did once." Charles, the rooster, flew up on a fence post. "Ladies and gentlemen," he cried, "comrades on many a hard-fought field, You have heard the glorious news. Again our ancient enemy raises his foul head. Again the leader of a cruel and vindictive horde of savage barbarians. He menaces the peace that like a soft blanket broods over the hills of Bean. Rise, animals, in your might. Let the old battle cry resound. Claws and teeth, comrades, claws and teeth. Ouch! He yelled suddenly as his wife, Henrietta, seized him by the tail feathers and pulled him down. You and your brooding blanket, she said sarcastically. You and your foul head. Now you rise in your might and go on back to the hen house so we can hear what Freddy has to say. So then Freddy told them all about that, what had happened at Lakeside. Or perhaps not quite all, for if he didn't tell how he and Mr. Camphor had fallen over each other, running away from the ghost, or how silly he had looked spinning over the lake like a fly on the window pane, I don't know why you should blame him. You wouldn't have told anybody either. The animals were disturbed to hear that Simon had probably turned up again. But as Freddy pointed out, there was nothing they could do until he had more facts to give them. He would continue his investigations. They could be ready, and when he needed their help, he would send for them. In the meantime, he said, I'd better go see that chipmunk who has some information about Simon. Where'd you say he lived, Jinx? Macy's, down on the flat, said the cat. There's a little pond. Used to be an ice pond. Sure, I know the place, said Freddy impatiently. You sure you can find it? The chipmunk says there's a little clump of birches on the west side. I told you I know the place, Freddy said. Pooh, I could find it my way there with my eyes shut. The cat grinned. Oh yeah? Want to bet on it? Freddy put on his great detective expression, which consisted of pressing his mouth very tightly together and squinting his eyes so that he looked suspicious and determined all at the same time. He had practiced this expression before the looking glass until he was now almost perfect, and strangers were often quite terrified by it. Certainly not, he snapped, too busy for such foolishness. But Jinx just laughed. You kill me, pig, he said. Look, smooth out that face before it sets that way, and I'll make a deal with you. You know that red velvet cushion I sleep on? It's just the thing to put in your big chair now that it's busted and the springs stick into you. If you can find that pond blindfolded, you can have the cushion. Look, Jinx, Freddy began, I haven't time. A nice, soft, thick, red velvet cushion, said Jinx. With that in your chair, you can get your nose up over the edge of the table instead of sitting practically on the floor, reaching up over your head to use the typewriter. As far as saving time goes, you're so smart, you can get there just as quick with a blindfold on as without. Of course, if you don't find the pond. Freddy made up his mind. I'll find it all right. You don't need to think up a forfeit way to make me pay. Yeah, said the cat, you're a sly one. I thought you'd try that. No, if you don't find the pond, then you'll have to, let's see, you'll have to take me to the movies in Centerboro and buy me a soda afterwards. And after thinking it over for a minute, Freddy agreed. So that is the end of chapter 6, and let's look at our pictures. Here is Freddy waking up after the night on the campsite. Of course, remember, the tents were torn down and they had to just sleep in the sleeping bags. And here is a picture of poor Freddy twirling around in his canoe because remember, his weight made the canoe tip to where the edge was out of it, and then he didn't know what to do. And it says his weight made the bow come right up out of the water. And we can see that, right? And then that is the end of the chapter 6. And next time we'll read chapter 7. And this is Grandma Carla, and I love you.